So when they traveled to the conference, who were the people that they went to meet? This is a drawing, a hand drawing of the 6 women who ended up traveling to Toronto and also to Canada. 2 of them were from Laos, 2 of them from South Vietnam, 2 of them from North Vietnam. And an older Asian American activist talked about that particular encounter. Their physical presence had a tremendous impact on the hundreds of third world and white women. Here are 6 Asian women, physically small, sincere, friendly, often appearing extremely tired. Yet whenever one spoke, it was with such clarity and with a background of personal involvement that the meaning of a people's revolution became a reality. This quote, I think, is very interesting because there's something about the physicality of these women, right? That they're small, that they're Asian, that for this Nisei, she can identify with them. But beyond that sense of identification, she was really interested in hearing their political lessons. Some people who are surviving the war and who are organizing against the war. I mentioned before that in this meeting between Asian American and Asian women, that they are articulating a transnational critique of American militarism. One of the things that they're emphasizing is what Joanne Nagel has talked about in terms of a military-sexual complex. So instead of this military-industrial complex, she's arguing that the military also creates a sexual complex. That when the U.S. military is abroad, there is the growth of sex industries, there is a growth of camp towns, there is the fostering of interracial intimacies, whether it's commercialized or not. And for the Vietnamese women who are talking about the impact of war, that's something that they're raising, is the ways in which their culture are being sexualized and commercialized as a result of the U.S. military. There's also, I'll come to this point in just a minute. They're also talking about the ways in which sexual activity, sexual violence is used as a tool of war. That includes rape, that includes molestation, that is not something exceptional about U.S. military behavior, but it's actually part of the arsenal of U.S. war. And again, I'll talk about this in just a minute. But just to give you an example of some of these points I'm making. An Asian American GI talked about his experiences being in the U.S. military during the Vietnam War. We had these classes we had to go to taught by the drill instructors, and every instructor would tell a joke before he began class. It would always be a dirty joke, usually having to do with prostitutes they had in Japan or in other parts of Asia while they were being stationed overseas. The attitude of Asian women being a doll, a useful toy, or something to play with usually came out in these jokes, and how they were not quite as human as white women, how Asian women's vaginas weren't like a white woman's, but rather they were slanted like their eyes. And he's talking about the ways in which this racialized sexual culture is used to demean not just Asian American women, but Asian people more generally. And that's why I wanted to point out this thing about militarized socialization. He's saying that this is just part of the drill instruction. It doesn't actually have to do anything to do with the actual instruction that the military is trying to provide, but it's part of the broader culture. It's a way in which men might bond with another, that they can talk about their sexual exploits and how strange and bizarre these Asian women are. One of the Asian American activists during this time period talked about the impact of these type of racializations. We as Asian American women cannot separate ourselves from our Asian counterparts. Racism against them is too often racism against us. The mentality that keeps Susie Wong, Madame Butterfly, and Gukism alive turns human beings into racist, murdering soldiers, and also keeps Asian Americans from being able to live and feel like human beings. This is by Evelyn Yoshimura, who was based in the Los Angeles area. So here's what I want to turn into this example, the My Lai massacre. The My Lai massacre occurred shortly after the Tet Offensive. This was an unexpected assault on various urban centers throughout Vietnam. The United States had been predicting that they were going to win the war. All of a sudden, during Tet, New Year's, there was a series of organized attacks. And even though the United States was eventually able to beat back some of those attacks, there was a sense that the United States government was lying, because how could it say that it was winning the war when all these attacks actually happened? After the war, the U.S. military was very much interested in making sure that people who were responsible paid for their actions. There was a report that a village was housing counterinsurgents. So the U.S. military entered that village. They actually had false information, and during that whole day, nobody actually fired back at the U.S. military. But they entered the village and they ended up killing more than 500 people in the village. That's what My Lai is. I went to visit My Lai during my first visit to Vietnam, and it's an incredible site. Many of you have a chance to go. What remains now are their plots where where houses used to be. And for each house, there might be a plaque saying that a grandmother lived here and this is their age, or a baby lived here and the baby was 2. So you really get a sense of the familial connections that actually used to exist. After that attack, it was actually covered up for a period of time. But eventually, one of the people responsible for the attack was tried. And that person's trial occurred at the same time as the Indo-Chinese Women's Conferences. Even though he was found guilty, his sentence was pretty much communicated, and he didn't really serve much time. This was by President Richard Nixon. And when these women are traveling around Canada talking about the war, they were asked repeatedly, what did you think about the My Lai massacre? What did you think about this person getting off without actually having any responsibility? And they said something which I deeply admire, but also surprised me. But they talked about the fact that it was the US government that put people in that position, that they had to commit these types of acts in order to survive, that it's the US government's responsibility. And so they were, in some ways, alleviating some of the blame from the soldiers themselves. So I've talked a little bit about how these different groups have communicated with women from Vietnam. I've talked about how Asian and Asian American women have fostered a certain type of critique of US militarism. Now I want to kind of go back to this idea of radical Orientalism and think about how women from the West, which can include women from different racial backgrounds, different generations, different ideologies, how they perceived women from the East. This is a poem by Juanita Lott, who's a Filipina activist. And this is what she says: how can your people, right, addressing the Vietnamese, how can your people maintain such discipline, understanding, and humanity? 1 million soldiers have been killed or wounded. 3 million civilians have been killed or wounded. 150,000 children are orphaned. 50,000 people are imprisoned. 39,000 women over the age of 12 are prostitutes. 6,000 American bombers have been shot down. And this is the response that she's rendering in this poem. For 25 years, we have been defending our land. What our fathers began, we continue. What we do not finish, our children will continue, and even their children's children, until the enemy is driven out, until the people win, until there is peace. Something I find really interesting about this poem is that Juanita, as an Asian American, even if she has an identification with these Vietnamese women who are coming, she talks about this binary sense between us and them, right? How can you? She's not saying how can we, but how can your people? How do you do these things, right? How do you maintain and survive this type of atrocity and still fight on? And in reply, the Vietnamese women both say that we are doing something that several generations have been doing, right? Our fathers, our children. But at the same time, the final line is that until the people win, which is that the Vietnamese women are trying to include Asian American women, they're trying to include women from the West to say you can be part of this movement. So there's an interesting tension between their desire to include and then Juanita's both admiration for these women, but also putting them on a political pedestal, right? How can you do this type of thing? This image I think is very interesting. It shows the variety of roles that Vietnamese women were playing during the war. They're fighting, they're carrying materials. And then this image, you have this big American military personnel who's being captured by this tiny Asian woman. And that image in some ways exemplifies the type of underdog status that Vietnam had against the US during the war. Okay. So I want to go back and just kind of wrap up some of the main themes. I wanted to rethink global sisterhood because oftentimes that concept has been used to talk about how the West imposes ideas on the rest of the world. And what I found in my research on the Vietnam War and women's peace activism is that women from the East, Vietnamese women, are fostering political agendas, they're advocating for political issues, they're active partners, and sometimes they're even unequal partners, they're seen as even greater partners because they actually have political experience in creating a revolution, in running a military, in political negotiations with foreign dignitaries. That there is both this desire to other Vietnamese women, seeing them as victims, but also this desire to see them as political role models, and that there's a partnership between both Vietnamese women and Asian American women in cultivating this type of international sisterhood. And I hope that these type of examples might help us more broadly rethink Asian American activism and also Asian American feminism. Okay, so that's it.